Okay, this is part two, or lecture two of two, on Plato's Euthyphro dialogue. All right, we are on the slide 18 for those of you who have my PowerPoint slides. We finished up with 17, and the big question on slide 17, you don't really need the slides, by the way, is Socrates asks Euthyphro, in response to Euthyphro's now third attempt to answer the question, what is piety, which is his second definition, which adds the word all to the first definition. First definition was what the gods love is pious and what they hate is impious. Second definition, what all the gods love is pious and what they all hate is impious, which then bypasses contradicting gods, which disagree with each other, in which case the same thing is both pious and impious. So we don't have that problem, right? Just a little recap here. So Socrates gets this new definition, but the things that the gods do agree upon, maybe that's what's moral or pious or just or good. What all the gods love, which is equivalent to what one god loves, right? No disagreements there. So Socrates, evaluating that, asks the question, is it the case that piety is what all the gods love and impiety is what all the gods hate, or what God loves and hates? Is that what makes something pious, or is it the other way around? Do the gods love something because it already is pious or moral or just or good? Right? And that's the big question of the dialogue. Really, what is the nature of piety or morality or goodness or justice or fairness or righteousness? All of those morally positive terms can be bundled together because of the doctrine of the unity of the virtues. They're all, in a way, the same. They emanate from the same source, which is, I guess, goodness itself or something like that, right? So what makes something moral or pious or holy or good? The fact that the gods love it? Or is it already good, and that's why the gods love it? That's the question, right? And Euthyphro doesn't get it, and Socrates uses what I call a grammatical analogy. Socrates didn't use the term grammatical analogy. I'm not sure they even had the word grammar yet in ancient Greek. But my analysis of the way that he reasons is that he's tapping into our understanding of when things sound grammatically correct or incorrect, right? And there's a distinction in grammar between something being spoken in the active voice or the passive voice. You say, I killed someone, right? That's active, right? If you say, someone was killed by me, that's passive, right? And your English teachers will try to tell you, write in the active voice, right? Now I make that's a kind of English grammatical, well, it doesn't matter what language it is, it's a grammatical distinction between the active voice and the passive voice. But there's a parallel distinction that maps onto active and passive, and that's a distinction between cause and effect, right? If I kill someone, right, it follows logically, maybe as a kind of effect of that fact, that someone was killed by me, right? But the effect is just a kind of logical consequence. It doesn't have any causal powers of its own, nor, and you might even want to say, what does the explaining and what is explained, right? So that's kind of like maps onto active and passive and cause and effect. So if I kill someone, right, that it kind of explains why it's true in a way that they were killed by me. But that they were killed by me doesn't explain why it is that I killed them, right? I'm just that new example about killing or being killed by me, right? But Socrates uses three examples. I'm carrying something, right? Whenever that's true, something's being carried by me. But the fact that it's kind of being carried by me is not, that doesn't explain why I'm carrying it, right? If I'm carrying a backpack or a bag or a laptop bag or whatever it is, why am I carrying it? the question, why am I carrying that? Why am I doing that? Is not answered by statements like, oh, you're carrying it because it's being carried by you. Right? And so that's the carrying example that Socrates uses. And then the other one is seeing. Yes, I'm looking at something, maybe because I want to read it or study it or examine it or it caught my eye or something like that. But what explains why I'm looking at it is not the mere fact that it's being looked at by me, right? So what Socrates is saying is something being carried by me or being looked at by me, that explains nothing. That's kind of like if there was a light, oh yeah, you could see the shadow over my face, but if there was a bright light on my hand, you would see the exact shape of my hand cast as a shadow, right? My hand causes the shadow, not the other way around. The shadow doesn't explain the hand. The hand explains the shadow. Right now, you might be able to infer the shape of the hand from the shape of the shadow, just like you could infer that if my bag is being carried by me, it's true that I'm carrying it, right? But the fact that it's being carried by me doesn't explain why I'm carrying it, right? So there's this kind of active and passive, or cause and effect, or the thing being explained and what does the explanation, right? All those kinds of ways of distinguishing things are kind of grammatical or logical distinctions, because grammar is just kind of like the logic of word sequencing, word combination rules, or something like that, right? So Socrates is saying that something being loved by or carried by or some verbed by something, right, never explains the activity in the verb, right? The fact that my bag is being carried by me doesn't explain why I'm carrying it, right? And so by analogy, the fact that something is loved by the gods doesn't explain why they love it, right? The gods love action X, whatever it is, like Achilles cutting off the head of the statue of the god Apollo, right? Assuming that they all love that or whatever it is, right? The mere fact that it's being loved by the gods, it's God beloved, as Euthyphro would say, that doesn't explain why the gods love it, right? Just like my bag being carried by me doesn't explain why I'm carrying it, or the fact that you're being loved by me doesn't explain why I love you, supposing that I do. I love all my students. And so on. And so it's kind of like, it doesn't make sense. Grammatically, it doesn't sound right. If you said, why am I loving you? Because you're being loved by me. Why am I carrying my bag? Because it's being carried by me? No, that doesn't sound right. So one of the grammatical intuitions that I like to use, but like some people speak a kind of slang English where what I'm about to say might not even sound ungrammatical to them. But the main idea about grammatical intuitions, pardon me, is that we have a kind of grammatical intuition sense, like an antenna, where we could hear that something doesn't sound right. It's ungrammatical. So that means it doesn't really make sense, right? That means our grammatical mind is smarter than even our conscious mind. If we can't say what's really wrong with it grammatically, but we know that there's something wrong with it grammatically, we have an antenna. So my cousin, Trip, had a girlfriend who used to say, do you know what time is it? And he would correct her and he'd say, that's not how you say it. It's what time it is. Do you know what time it is? And she would say, if I get this wrong, I want to get this right. She would say, do you know what time is it? And then he would try to correct her and she'd say, okay, what time it is, right? Because he would say, no, what time is it? Or something like that, right? And so either way, like even when he tried to correct her, she was a sweet girl, but she would get that wrong. For some reason, her grammatical antenna wasn't working, but his was, right? Okay, so this is a complicated and very subtle logical analysis that Socrates tries to walk Euthyphro through. I have it on my slide, by the way, in two categories, active and passive. Active is I'm carrying it, I'm looking at it, I love it. Passive is It's being carried by me. It's being looked at by me. It's being loved by me, that sort of thing, right? But the main point is that Euthyphro's definition, what is loved by all the gods, it's in the wrong kind of category, grammatically or logically. That doesn't explain why they love it. And Euthyphro gets that. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. But before we move on to the next attempted definition, right, Euthyphro's theory, even though he acknowledges that it's wrong, is pretty much largely adopted by many religious thinkers from many different religious traditions, from different religions and theologies, right? And philosophers like this dialogue because this theory appears here, and philosophers like to give it a particular name. So we're on slide 19. DCT is the abbreviation for the first three letters of the words divine command theory, right? So the idea is that more abstractly, not just in terms of what the gods love, but what they command, right? Whether there's one God or many gods, because we noticed if all the gods agree, that's equivalent to there being one God, right? So philosophers like to say, regardless of what religion you adhere to or how many gods you think there are, it doesn't make a difference in the case of this definition because it's neutral as to how many gods there are, right? Whether the gods all agree or whether one God has the same attitude towards something all the time, right? It's a kind of divine attitude toward X, whatever it is. And what the gods want us to do, they command us to do. So this idea, in the Ten Commandments, for instance, in Judeo-Christian ethics, which goes back to the Bible, right? God commands us to do this and not to do that, right? And so if Euthyphro's theory that what gods love or what divinity loves is pious or just or good, if that theory would be correct, then whatever God commands would implicitly be good. If God said, thou shalt do X, then doing X is implicitly good because presumably if God commands it, he wants us to do that. He has a positive attitude towards it, so he approves of it. This is called the divine command theory of ethics. God is presumably, or divinity is the source of all moral goodness, and so when divinity expresses a positive attitude towards something, we can infer that that is good. And that's how we find out that something is good, right? God likes it or loves it or commands it. So on my slide, I say we could substitute for pious, the word pious in this formula, any positive moral term, right? Like something is not only pious if it is loved by the gods, but it is moral, good, right, righteous, upright, virtuous, fair, just, and so on, right? Desirable, whatever, right? So X, whatever it is, has a positive moral value, right? Just, good, pious, holy, and so on, right? If it is loved by divinity. And then for loved by divinity in the formula, we could substitute other positive attitude terms that divinity might have, right? Like not just loved, but preferred, desired, prescribed, commanded, and so on, right? So then like no matter what it is, X has a positive moral value if divinity has a positive attitude toward X, right? And similarly, conversely, negative, right? X has a negative moral value. It's immoral, unjust, unholy, impious, and so on. If divinity has a negative attitude towards X, meaning divinity dislikes it, hates it, prohibits it, forbids it, it rejects it, and so on, right? So this abstract formula, right? X has a positive or negative moral value if God has a positive or negative attitude, respectively, toward X. That's the most abstract way of understanding the logical components of DCT, or divine command theory, right? Philosophers, again, like it because it could be seen in many different religious philosophies or religious theories of ethics, right? Ideas about the nature of ethics, which say that ethics stem from God's goodness, right? That's the divine command theory of ethics or of morals, right? And it's intuitive to many pious people and believers and even theologians, although we'll see that there are some problems with it. So on the next slide now, I'm going to, slide 20, create three categories of what I call morally obvious things. Things that are obviously moral, things that are obviously moral, things that are obviously immoral, and things that are obviously neutral, morally speaking, in the middle. So there's three columns: immoral, neutral, and moral, right? And now I typically make a kind of preface by saying, look, one of the great things that philosophy students can do, or philosophy teachers or philosophers in general, is take a claim and find objections to it or counterexamples. So if the claim was, all swans are white, and I show you a black swan, that's a counterexample. It falsifies the claim, right? So I'm going to put things in these categories, right? Like, so offering a seat on the bus to like an elderly person would normally be considered an obviously morally good thing to do, but you could imagine some circumstances under which it wouldn't be, right? Like if that old woman got on the bus and was nasty, didn't pay her fare, shoved someone and knocked them down, and was arrogant and so on, then you would say, well, you really, any claim that the woman might have that it would be the right thing for you to do to give her your seat, by giving her your seat, you'd kind of be validating her negative behavior and invalidating, everything that, like the moral judgments that people would have against what she just did, right? So what we say in philosophy is leave out all those kinds of possible complications and possible counterexamples, right? And when we try to do that, we use a phrase, all other things being equal. And there's a Latin phrase which means the same thing, ceteris paribus, spelled Ceterus or is, I forget. No, US, I think. Yeah, and paribus, Paribus. And I don't know the exact translation, but in Latin, that means the same thing. Like keeping all other possible variations off the table, right? So, so entertain my lists of things that are obviously morally good and obviously morally bad and obviously morally neutral, like all other things being equal, leaving off things like that old lady who got on the bus just killed 3 people or whatever, right? Or flipping a light switch might be morally neutral, but not if you knew it was attached to a bomb, that sort of thing, okay? Or even that slavery is obviously wrong. Oh, well, there were times in human history where we thought it was right, or you could imagine some scenario where people opted in and took a gamble on becoming a millionaire or becoming a slave, or just leave all those things aside. All other things being equal. So in my obviously morally good category, I've got offering a seat on a bus, saving a drowning baby from dying, giving blood, sacrificing a life, and by that I mean sacrificing your own life, maybe to save the lives of others. Like a Marine might jump on a grenade, to save the life of the rest of his friends, or giving to charity, right? So then in the obviously neutral category, I have things like left-handed writing as opposed to right-handed, right? You cross your left leg over your right when you're sitting in a chair, or vice versa. It doesn't make a difference, right? You write with your left hand, your right hand. Of course, like I said, you could imagine scenarios where it matters. Breathing, of course, you don't want Hitler to keep breathing, but that's irrelevant. All other things being equal, breathing in and of itself is kind of morally neutral, as is walking, as is reading a newspaper, and as is maybe working, like working on a school paper or delivering newspapers or, whatever it is, right? Now, once again, if you fail to work, but you have great responsibilities to your children and your family for child support or whatever, and you fail to work, then maybe we could say rep that. But we're leaving these things out of it, all other things being equal. It's kind of morally neutral, whether or not you engage in certain activities at a certain time and get paid for them, right? Of course, if you're a hitman, that's a different story, right? And then in the obviously immoral category, I'm going to get a little outlandish about this, but killing an innocent person to appease someone else in power, like maybe to join the mafia or some gang, you might be asked to go and slit somebody's throat or something like that to prove that you're willing to kill innocent people or kill someone on command or something like that, right? We generally tend to think that doing that, killing an innocent person just to appease someone in power above you or whatever, is more immoral, all right? Of course, you find yourself in one of those prison movies where it's do or die, that's a different story. It's all other things being equal, we're leaving those things out of it. Next one I have on my list is babies at bus like eggs. All right, now this might seem a little strange, but when I was a kid, or at Halloween time, kids would throw eggs at each other and spray shaving cream on, all that kind of stuff. But we would also throw the eggs at New York City buses, right? So the bus driver would stop the bus, and the windshield wiper thing wouldn't clean it, and everyone else. We were being like little horns on our head, troublemaker kids, right? But so I'm making an even worse example, like taking little human infants and throwing them at the bus, and they splatter on the windshield. Obviously immoral, along with, and this is not on the list, baby kebabs and things like that. We generally tend to think that things like that would be immoral. The next one I have is the rape, murder, and torture of an innocent child. I can't imagine anyone justifying that under any circumstances, except perhaps if that had been done to your child and you could go get the rapist and do it to his, but even then I don't think it would be morally justified. All right. Betrayal of a friend or your country, right? Most people think betrayal is betrayal. It's bad, right? And then, of course, the last things I have on the list are racism, slavery, etc. And by etc., I mean all forms of bigotry and hatred. All right, so that's the list, and those are the categories. And now, here comes Socrates' idea. If there are gods, or if there is a God, presumably they like the things that are obviously moral, they're neutral about the things that are obviously morally neutral, and they dislike the things that are obviously immoral because those things are in those categories, not the other way around, right? They like things that are obviously moral because they're obviously morally good, right? They reduce suffering, they help people, right? And the things that are obviously immoral cause unjustifiable harm and suffering to innocent people. Those things are obviously bad, right, for those reasons. And the things that are neutral because they neither help nor hurt anyone per se, all other things being equal. It's because obviously morally good things have good, morally good, positive characteristics about them that the gods love them, or God loves it. And it's because bad things have negative characteristics that the gods dislike them. And because the neutral things are morally neutral, that the gods don't really command or forbid those things, right? And they would have the characteristics that they have whether or not there were gods. But if there are gods, they love the things that are morally good because they have morally positive characteristics. And they dislike the things that they forbid because they have negative moral characteristics built into them. That's Socrates' attitude. These things are lovable. That's why the gods love them. These things are despisable or despicable. That's why the gods dislike them. These things are neutral. That's why the gods are neutral about them. It's not the other way around. You could infer from the fact that the gods love these things that these things are good. It's like you can infer the shape of my hand from the shape of its shadow, right? Or you could infer that because I'm carrying my bag is being carried by me, that I'm carrying it, but not the other way around. That's the wrong direction of explanation, all right? So now if Euthyphro was right, however, that what puts the things in the categories is simply that these things wind up in the good category simply because the gods like them. The gods have no reason whatsoever for liking them. It's just a completely arbitrary and whimsical decision. Of all those things, if we took all those items and put them on one list, if Euthyphro was right, the gods could just say, put this one in this category, put that one in that category, put this one in that category. Oh, no, you know what? Put it over there. Like it really didn't matter. Like, I like chocolate. I don't like vanilla. Strawberry, kind of neutral about it. Right? But there's nothing about the flavors. It's just a mood, a totally random thing, right? If that was the case, then the gods could randomly reassign everything, right? But that doesn't make sense. Like if the gods had liked the rape, murder, and torture of an innocent child, right? And then commanded us every Wednesday you should rape, torture, and murder the third child that you see, then human beings, if this theory was correct, would look with devotion on anyone who did that and say, what a pious, holy man. He does that every Wednesday, right? But that doesn't make any sense at all. That's Socrates' criticism, and that's philosophers' criticisms of the divine command theory of morals, that it gets things backwards, all right? So moving on to the next slide, I say that there are some problems, another way of pointing out some problems with divine command theory. This was, I suppose this argument was made by a philosopher named James Rachel, that either God has a reason for the things that he loves, the things on the previous chart, right? Or he doesn't, right? So this is kind of dilemma like the Adam and Eve thing by LaCroix. Either Adam has the knowledge of right and wrong already, or he doesn't, right? Any proposition is either true or false. So it or its opposite have to be true if it's a meaningful statement, right? So either God has a reason, or the gods on the panel of agreeing gods have, or either divinity has a reason for why divinity has a positive attitude towards X, or divinity has no reason, right? So if divinity has no reason, then it would be completely arbitrary, like I just said, and divinity could command us to torture every third child that we see. And divinity would just be like a cosmic power, right? It's not that divinity is good-natured and it identifies things that happen to be good and says those are the good things, right? It's just randomly assigning values to things that it, for no reason whatsoever, likes or dislikes, right? And then, like I said, the pious or the holy would be those who obeyed those rules, right? Now, there's a problem with that. There's a logical problem with that. And that is the idea that God is good. We call this the doctrine of God's goodness, the claim that God is inherently good. God's nature is goodness itself, or God is love, or something like that, right? God is inherently benevolent, right? If God is not inherently benevolent, then God is kind of like a gangster. It's just cosmic power. He's all powerful, but he's not all good, right? And that's no different from the local gangster, the head of the mafia or something, right? If the head of the mafia says, these are the things that you do, these are the things that you don't do, you want to get in good graces with the head of the mafia, you do what he says, and you don't do what he doesn't say, otherwise you're going to suffer. Now, if you're treating God that way, that kind of doesn't, that eliminates the idea that God is good, but it kind of reflects on you that you're no longer really being motivated by genuinely moral reasons. You're being motivated by selfish reasons. You just want to get in the good graces of the powerful, right? So that's not something that's respectable, or like God, for that reason, wouldn't be worthy of worship. There's a sign on the mosque in Bensonhurst where I used to live when I used to go jogging, preparing for my marathons. I jog all around the neighborhood for hours on end, and I used to pass this mosque a lot. I think it's on West 8th Street between Avenue S and the next block or whatever. It was an Ahmadiyya mosque, and the banner carved into the stone across the whole side of it was, "No being is worthy of worship except Allah, except God." So the idea of being worthy of worship, right? If God is just a cosmic power, a tyrant, right, like a gangster, right, the most powerful being in the universe, but he's not morally good, then he's not morally worthy of worship, of genuine moral praise and devotion, right? It's just a kind of self-interested protectionism, right? So God, by that kind of reasoning, God has to be inherently good, right? So, but if God's commands are completely morally arbitrary, right, then he can command things that are moral or immoral, and then make things that are immoral moral by saying, thou shalt torture every third baby you see, which is obviously immoral. That makes no sense. I said this would undermine the doctrine of God's goodness. Here's a logical way of pointing out how. If the divine command theory is right, and God would have to have no reason, by the way, if divine command theory was right. It's just his preferences that make things good or bad, right? Then blank, or X, right? X is good according to divine command theory, means X is loved by God, right? So if that, and that's what divine command theory says, and if that was correct, then the statement God is good would simply mean God is loved by God, or God is approved of by God, or God has a positive attitude towards himself. But that statement is circular and meaningless. To be good would have no meaning. It would just mean that God approves of himself, even when he commands that we torture every third child that we see. Right? So then the idea that that there's some meaning or content to the claim God is good would vanish. It would become circular and meaningless. Right? That's not what believers believe. Believers in the doctrine of God's goodness think that the word and the concept of goodness has a genuine meaning. Things like love and benevolence and care, reducing suffering, promoting well-being, generosity, kindness, all of those things are aspects of what it means to be good. And those things are not associated with torturing innocent people for no reason, right? But if there was no reason why God picks the things that he picks, that would be possible. Therefore, that line of reasoning shows that it refutes itself, right? On the other hand, if God has a reason for why the things are in the good category, the bad category, or the neutral category, those reasons are probably because these things are bad, these things are neutral, and these things are good, right? And what makes them good is that they reduce suffering, they improve well-being. What makes them bad is that they cause unjust suffering to innocent people and so on, etc., about the neutral, right? Then those reasons, those characteristics of the things are what make them what they are, and God's aware of those reasons, and that's why he likes the things that he likes and dislikes the things that he dislikes. But if that's the case, then it's the characteristics of the things that put them in this box and that one and this one that put them in there. Those are God's reasons would be his knowledge of those characteristics that things have, right? That good things are good for the reasons that they're good. But those reasons are the same reasons that we could understand, which is why I said we can know what things belong in which of those three categories, whether or not there's a God, right? So that's the other criticism, right? If God has reasons, then divine command theory is false. Then it's not just God's attitudes that make things good or bad, even if you could infer from God's attitudes that they're good or bad, right? Just like you could infer from the fact that my bag is being carried by me that I'm carrying it, or that I love someone, that someone's being loved by me, that you could infer that I love them, right? The fact that God loves those things or likes them, you could infer from that those things are good. Right? But that's not what makes them good or explains why they're good or explains why the gods love them. All right? Okay, some more problems. Next slide, slide 22. With, I might change these PowerPoints down the road so the slide numbers could change for people watching this, down the road, not in the original. All right, but the title of this slide is Problem Biblical Examples. Okay, so now if divine command theory was correct, right, we have another problem with Adam and Eve, which we already talked about with Richard LaCroix's criticism, the paradox of Eden, right? Because if God commands, this is a different problem, if God commands Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right, he has a negative attitude toward that, then having the knowledge of good and evil would be negative or wrong. But God has that knowledge, right? In which case God would be immoral. So that's one problem. In addition to the problem that we talked about in the subject matter of Richard LaCroix's article on the paradox of Eden, right? About Adam already knew or he didn't know. Right? If he already knew, then he was created immoral because he was created with something God forbids him to have. And if he didn't know, then he couldn't have understood that it would be wrong to disobey God, or whether or not it was right to listen to Eve or the snake, and so on, right? So we already know that problem. Next problem is with Cain and Abel. If God commanding us, thou shalt not kill, is what informs us that killing is wrong, God had not yet said that until Moses came along with the Ten Commandments, but he punished Cain for killing Abel, even though God had not said, thou shalt not kill. Right? But if human beings, or you want to try to defend God on that one, you could say, well, once they ate the fruit, all human beings are born with the knowledge of good and evil. Well, then if that's the case, then we don't need God to tell us what's right from what's wrong, right? So that's problematic either way, but it seems problematic that God punished Cain without having forbidden murder yet. And it wasn't a mild punishment. Cain said, this punishment is unbearable. Okay, Abraham, another example. Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Him and Sarah, it took them over 90 years, I forget how many years exactly, to have a child. And then God asks Abraham to murder his son Isaac as a sacrifice to him. Yes, it only turned out to be a test, but still, when God commanded, requested, required, whatever, Abraham to do it, if divine command theory is right, that implies that killing an innocent person to appease a being in power is moral. But we found that on this list, the immoral list, right? That's what you do for gangsters, right? Of course, now God asked him not to go through with it, stopped him, but still, it sends a very bad message, right? Because, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, maybe especially Islam, take Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his own moral compass, so to speak, the knowledge that killing your innocent son just to appease a being more powerful than you, that's intuitively on this side of the chart, it's bad. Being willing to do something terrible because God or some being more powerful than you asked you to do it, because of that willingness, the children of Israel are rewarded, right? They wind up becoming the chosen people. Christians, Jews, and Muslims all think that that act is one of the greatest things in the history of religion. I said particularly Islam because Islam means submission or surrender to the will of Allah, right? That's why Abraham completely surrendered, trusting God to even do this horrible thing if God asked him to do it, right? And then now that sends a terrible message to humanity, in my opinion, that the thing that's on this category is okay as long as your religion tells you to kill people, then it's okay, right? And that's not a good message. That's problematic. More problematic, I think, is that the very same Abraham, later in the exact same story in the Bible, in the same chapter, gets wind that God is planning on destroying Sodom, the city of sin, Sodom and Gomorrah, the twin evil cities. And Abraham, the pinnacle of submission to God's will and surrender and not questioning God's ethics. Okay, I'll kill my son. Out comes the knife. Argues with God about this and tells God, it would be immoral of you, it would be morally wrong of you to destroy a whole city if I can find 50 innocent men or righteous men. And then and God agrees, and he haggles with God. The numbers keep going down, 3 or 4 steps, I forget how many, until he gets to 10 men. If he was rewarded for completely surrendering his moral compass to God, then why wasn't he punished for not only not surrendering his moral compass to God, but for criticizing God morally and trying to tell God what to do morally? Why weren't all of his descendants penalized forever instead of rewarded forever? This is just an inconsistency in divine command theory, right? That you find in the Bible, right? Like, these are indirect consequences. Abraham is praised kind of for accepting divine command theory, but he's not punished for kind of rejecting it. All right, next slide is entitled Cases Where It Might Make Sense. And this is my thinking, right? Consider the Sabbath, right? Now, on my chart in the middle, there were morally neutral things like reading a newspaper and working and walking and breathing and being left-handed, right? So working at a particular time of day or during a particular day of the week is kind of relatively morally neutral, right? But when God says, you know what, on this day of the week, the seventh day, I would like you not to work because I'm your parent and you're my child. And on that day, I want you to spend some time with me, right? So God in the role of parent can take a morally neutral thing, like working on a certain day, and give it a morally positive or negative value. If God says, I don't want you to work on that day, I want you to relate to me. That's the day that you pray and relate to me, come to temple or whatever. God has taken a neutral thing and given it a moral or a negative value. So if you obey God and observe the Sabbath, right, then that's morally good. If you disobey God and work on the Sabbath, then that's morally negative because you've disrespected and gone against the will and wishes of your creator/father, right? Now, this doesn't convert a negative or a positive into a positive or a negative. It converts a neutral into a positive or a negative, whether or not you obey or disobey, right? Whereas the thing with Abraham would convert a negative into a positive, right? And that doesn't make sense. But there's no problem with things like the Sabbath, right? Similarly, water, right? You can drink it, you can play with it in a squirt gun, use it to water plants or wash your car, right? But if it's literally, if turning water into holy water, let's just say, by having it blessed by a priest, makes it holy, then you shouldn't play with it in a squirt gun, etc., right? Or wash your car with it. Right, so this is a similar thing. Water is morally neutral in and of itself, but once it takes on a spiritual value because of a designation that came indirectly or directly from God, that's different. Same thing with a place, right? An ordinary building is one thing, but a church or a temple or a mosque is another, right? So it's a morally neutral thing that takes on a morally positive value, in which case morally negative activities shouldn't happen in that place, right? Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. So now we're done beating up the divine command theory and Euthyphro's third answer to the question, what is piety, which is his second definition, right? What all the gods love. Once Euthyphro understands Socrates, says, okay, let's try this again. And again, you get to see Socrates being a midwife of ideas, trying to help Euthyphro to formulate he does have some wisdom and knowledge, he just can't articulate it right. So he's the midwife of ideas, but he's also being charitable, right? Saying, like, I know that you've got something there, Euthyphro. Let me help you to try to formulate it in a way that might be better, right? That formulation was problematic, but maybe there's another way. So Socrates starts asking him questions like, Euthyphro, tell me, and by the way, the title of this slide is Transition to Fourth Answer, which is also the third definition. Which category is the greater category, piety or justice? And Euthyphro's like, what? He doesn't really get it, right? So Socrates says, well, he makes some comparisons. He says, which category is the larger category, odd or number? Like odd numbers and even numbers, or numbers? And Euthyphro's like, oh, well, number, obviously, because there are twice as many numbers in principle between any segment of the number series than there are odd numbers or even numbers, right? Although when it comes to the infinite nature of them, it's kind of puzzling, right? It's like there's twice as many numbers as there are odd numbers or even numbers, right? Just numbers, right? But the number series is infinite. So how could the series of odd numbers is infinite too, and so is the series of even numbers, right? So how could one series that's infinite be larger than another series that's infinite? This is called transfinite mathematics. It's very confusing. We'll just leave it at that, having noted it. But you could still get Socrates' idea if you just say any random segment of 100 numbers sequentially out of that series of 100 numbers, like between 0 and 100 or between 299 and 399, it doesn't matter. Are there more numbers or more odd numbers, right? That kind of thing. All right. And then the other example that he gives is confusing. It's between fear and shame. And I don't think this is a good example, but Socrates thinks fear is the larger category because every case of fear is one thing. Although, let me say that in a different way. Not all cases of fear involve shame, but all cases of shame involve fear. So you might imagine that there's a million things to be feared, but there's only 1,000 things to be ashamed of, right? And like so, but all the rest of them, like 999,000 things that could be feared, are not the kinds of things that you can be ashamed of. Like a warrior can fear the sword coming and cutting his head off. He's aware of that danger and he appropriately reacts to it by ducking or blocking with his sword, but he's not ashamed of avoiding death, right? So it's not the case that all cases of fear involve shame, but Socrates argues that all cases of shame involve fear because whatever you're ashamed of, you're normally afraid that people will find out, right? Like I said, not the best example. The examples that I like are better with more straightforward categories, like which is the bigger category, mammal or animal? And of course, animal is the larger category because all mammals are animals, but not all animals are mammals, right? Dinosaurs and reptiles and birds and fish are not mammals, right? But they're all animals, right? So all mammals are animals, but not all animals are mammals, right? And then which is the bigger category, sibling or relative, right? Well, all siblings are relatives, but not all relatives are siblings, like aunt and nephew and great-grandmother and so on, right? They might have siblings, but they might not, right? So relative is the larger category, right? And if you recall in my lecture 1 of 2, I believe, I said Aristotle, looking at Socrates asking these kinds of questions, particularly these questions, which is the larger category, and the next question that's going to come, which is how does it differ from other things that are like it, is the genus and species. Genus and species, the two things Aristotle said, if you have both of those, you've got a definition. He defined the concept of definition as giving the category and the distinction between other things in the category, the genus and the species, right, as a definition. So that's what Socrates is. He doesn't have the word definition. He might not even have the words genus and species. I don't know. I'm not an ancient Greek language scholar or historian of the period. But Socrates is implicitly asking for the genus and the species of piety. So which is the larger category, piety or justice? And Euthyphro answers quickly, oh, justice is the larger category, like justice relationships. Whether or not someone is pious or impious is that they're treating the religion or the gods the right way or the wrong way, right? But there are other kinds of ways of being right and wrong, or being moral and immoral, right? And so justice would be the larger category, right? Or right relationships or something like that. We can just call them justice. So that would be the genus. Piety is some kind of justice relationship. And then he tries to narrow it down a little bit, Socrates, and he says, well, what part of justice is piety, right? What kind of, he's still kind of zeroing in on the category. It's like, oh, maybe family member, what kind of family member? Sibling, okay? So maybe he's narrowing down the genus here, right? And he says, oh, it's the part about man's relationship to the gods, right? So let's move on to the next slide. I have a picture here that's called Justice Relationships is the name of the slide. And there's like a kind of a grid that has two columns and 4 rows. And in the first column, it's man to man, how humans treat humans. That's one kind of justice. Second category is how God treats man. So when man behaves or misbehaves, God treats man positively or negatively, rewards or punishes man. Next row is man to God, and I put that in bold. That's the one that Euthyphro says that's the type of relationship in the justice categories which concerns piety. Piety is a man to God justice relationship. It's how man treats God, positively or negatively, right? So the positive ones would be pious, and the negative ones would be impious, right? And then the last row is, because there are more than one God in Greece, how gods treat each other, because like Zeus punished his own father, Kronos, right? But if there's only one God, then the bottom row drops out. It doesn't exist. All right? Okay. So next slide is entitled Euthyphro's fourth attempt / third definition. Fourth attempt to answer the question, what is piety? This is his third attempt at defining it. Piety is a man-God-justice relationship in which man, right? And he says, well, what kind of thing does man do? He tends to the gods, Euthyphro says, like a priest in the temple, right? The things that a temple servant or priest does. He washes the statues, takes care of the temple, makes prayers and ritual offerings and sacrifices to the gods, right? And then gets all blessings in return from the gods, which is the God-man relationship in the second row, right? So we're good to the gods, then the gods reward us with victory in war, good harvest, and a good life in the afterlife in Hades, right? But if we are bad to the gods, we're impious, right? Then we get punished by the gods by failing in war, crops fail, and going to bad places in the afterlife, right? Okay, so that's Euthyphro's definition. And remember what I said about the Sabbath. I think that this definition works perfectly well when it comes to the things that God wants us to do spiritually or religiously in terms of relating to God, like observe the Sabbath. God sometimes informs us or reminds us of what the man-to-man justice rules are, like in the thou shalt not kill. That's a man-man thing, right? And those, recall with Socrates' criticisms of the divine command theory, man-to-man justice relationships, we can figure that out through the use of reason alone, right? That we shouldn't torture the innocent and stuff like that, right? But when it comes to man to God, God does have to inform us, right? Or we might even be able to figure that out, though. I don't know. I just thought about that, right? Like, there's no reason why we should mistreat God, right? But it might be the case that there are certain things, like observing the Sabbath, that we couldn't figure out on our own. Like, what day does God want us to set aside, right? Or how many times a day should I pray, right, if I'm a Muslim? That kind of information has to come from the gods. So in a way, this definition works for the man-God and God-man justice relationship, right? It might also be the case that God will punish us if we're evil towards other human beings, right? But that's secondary, right? That still doesn't validate the divine command theory. And Euthyphro's definition, I think, works in this category, the Sabbath-type rules. All right, let's move on to the next slide, which is called Socrates Replies. All right, so now, as is the Socratic method's way, you get an answer, no matter how good it is, then you got to try to assess it, evaluate it, critically analyze it, try to take it apart, see if you can come up with counterexamples to it, and test it to see if it makes sense and if it works. So Socrates is trying to do that now. He's got Euthyphro's third, and it turns out to be his final definition, because shortly after the dialogue will end, of piety, of what Euthyphro thinks piety, and Socrates is, really trying to take it apart, which is what philosophers do. Like, oh, are all swans white? No, I think I've seen a black swan. It's as simple as that, right? So this is the Socratic method. So Socrates asks Euthyphro, so you're saying piety is a kind of trade between men and gods. Like, we offer prayers and ritual sacrifices and offerings and devotion and respect and take care of the temples and all that kind of stuff. We give all those things to the gods, and then the gods give us, rewards when we're good. And of course, if we're disrespectful to the god, they punish us. So it's a kind of trade or an exchange between men and gods. And Euthyphro says, well, sort of, yeah, it's something like that. Although you can see that that's kind of weird direction to take it in. This is a kind of analysis. But are you saying that that's how it works? the kind of what we say quid pro quo, which is Latin for this for that. I give you this, you give me that. That seems a little cheap when it comes to God, right? So that's where Socrates is going. So Socrates says, well, do the gods really benefit from us giving them these things? And Euthyphro actually says something like, by Zeus, no. And I think implicit in that idea is that Euthyphro thinks that even though the gods battle with each other, they're still perfect in some way. They're immortal beings. They have superpowers that we can't really benefit them like in the same way that we could benefit each other, right? And then so Socrates says, well, then they're sort of bad tradesmen. Like we get all good things from them and they get nothing from us. And Euthyphro goes, no, they're not bad tradesmen. And then Socrates is like, well, then why do they want us to bother? Right? Why do they want us to be pious and good if they don't get anything out of it? And Euthyphro says, well, because it pleases them. Now remember that phrase from the first definition. Piety is what pleases the gods, or what the gods love, or what is God pleasing or God beloved, right? So Socrates is like, oy vey, Euthyphro, we're back to square one. Well, Socrates didn't have a Yiddish, Brooklyn accent. I just put that on there for fun. But that is how Socrates reacts, like, oh, no, not that again. Piety is what pleases the gods. We're back to square one, the first definition. Okay, next slide. I disagree. And it says, RR, that's me, Rip Rapetti. Analysis, Euthyphro was right, Socrates was wrong. Okay, I think Socrates loses his footing here. The phrase, quote, because it pleases the gods, quote, right, is not functioning as a definition here. Right? It was functioning the first time Euthyphro used it as a definition, right? Here it's functioning as a valid answer to Socrates' why question, right? Not what is piety, but why do the gods want us to be pious, right? That's a legitimate answer. You say, oh, because it pleases them. Well, Socrates could have said, well, we saw that was problematic earlier, so let me, and remember the problem was, if the gods love something, they must love it for a reason. So then Socrates could have and should have gone a step further, even in line with his own points that he made earlier, and said, why does it please them? Right? But instead they argued with each other about going in circles, right? Socrates says, we're going in circles. Euthyphro says, that's because of your questioning. Socrates says, no, that's because of your answers. And they go back and forth a little bit. And then, Euthyphro says, look, I had enough. I got to get out of here. I'm getting late for my trial. He looked at his little sundial watch. That's a joke. They didn't have sundial watches. And took off. And most philosophers think that this is because Euthyphro didn't know and he got it wrong. And Socrates proved that even the priests couldn't explain what holiness is, his own central concept or something like that. So philosophers 1, or philosophers 3 or 4 actually, because Euthyphro tried 4 times, and religious believers 0, right? But I think it's the other way around. So I'm going to try and defend Euthyphro here. And I say, compare a little anecdote from my son when he was about 4 or 5. At the time, he saw me playing cards, like poker and whatnot, and I had a deck of cards. That was, I guess, my favorite deck that I used to play with a lot. I had more than one, but that was the one I used a lot. And he saw me playing cards. I even played with him. We used to play War, a simple card game that even little kids could play. So I don't remember if it was Father's Day or Christmas or my birthday, or it was some gift-giving occasion where I had this little present from my son, and I opened it up. I took the wrapping paper off, and it was that deck of playing cards, the actual one, not like a new one or something. It was my playing cards that he gave to me. All right? So usually when students hear that, they go, oh, how sweet or something. But yeah, it was kind of cute and sweet and endearing, and it pleased me. But technically, it didn't benefit me, because I already owned those cards, right? So I didn't get anything out of it, right? But then you could ask me, if Socrates went a step further, he would say, well, why does that please you, Professor Rapetti? And I would say, because my son is trying to approximate the principles of gift giving. And I think that he actually there's more than one element to the concept of gift giving, but I think he got the most important element right, which many adults unfortunately don't get right. So how many of you have had this experience? You open up a present and you go, oh, a ceramic shoe? Wow, oh, wow, how unique. Thank you. And you regift that thing, right? So that'll never happen to my son, I suppose, because the principal part of it that he got right was that you should give people things that you know that they will like, right? So he got that right. So I was pleased to see that he was capable of analyzing things like what people do and extracting what they like and applied that as part of his gift-giving strategy, right? And why did that please me? Because I care about him and I care about his moral development. I want him to be happy in life because I love him, right? So seeing him learning, making generalizations, observations, pattern recognition, figuring out principles, and applying them showed me that he's making efforts to be the right kind of person, right? And to move in the right direction and to grow developmentally in wholesome and healthy ways that will benefit him in the long run and promote his own happiness and well-being, right? So like the gods, if they love us, if they're in some kind of parent, or God is a kind of a creator-parent type being, right? Then we're God's children and God loves us and cares about us and wants us to be happy. So if God sees us obeying or approximating the kinds of principles which, if we do embody them and internalize them and make them part of who we are, we will become the kinds of beings that will be healthy and happy and possibly in good relationships with God. And because God loves and cares about us, that's why it pleases God, right? So had Socrates gone a step further and not thought, oh, that's a failed definition again, you're holding out on me, and he says that to you, you're holding out on me, I got to go in there and defend myself, come on, teach me what piety is. Euthyphro goes, nah, I got to go, right? Socrates missed a step here. He wrongly interpreted Euthyphro's answer to the question, why do the gods like it when we're pious? As if it was a definition again, as if it was an answer to the question, what is piety? He already answered that. He gave a perfect Aristotelian, Aristotle-style, genus-species definition of what piety is, restricted to religious matters like the Sabbath, which works, I think, in all religions, right? And religions that view it the wrong way, they're simply wrong, right? I think it makes perfect sense. So the mere fact that the same phrase, because it's loved by the gods or something like it pleases them, occurred as part of a faulty definition doesn't mean it can't occur as part of a correct answer to another question, right? Same phrase can function well in one context, but not well in another. And Socrates overlooked that possibility here and misread the answer to his own question. He asked a why question, not a what question, and then he took the answer to the why question as if it was an answer to the what question. Socrates got confused. He lost his footing in his cross-examination and shot himself in the foot in the process because he failed to take in the explanatory power and richness and correctness of Euthyphro's final definition, which he could have used at his own trial to defend himself. So let's go on to the next slide, which says conclusion. Euthyphro, it's your fault we're going in circles. Socrates, no, it's your ideas. Blah, blah, blah. Please teach me. No, I got to go. Some friend you turned out to be, Socrates is thinking to himself. And it ends with no conclusion, once again. And most Socrates scholars will say, oh, most of these Socratic dialogues end inconclusively, which shows that philosophical inquiry just goes deeper and deeper, and there's no end to it. And so Socrates' understanding of what wisdom is, which is the knowledge of your own ignorance, is illustrated in this, that the priest doesn't even know what piety or holiness is, right? And that's just the nature of human intellect. It's limited, right? But I don't think that those conclusions really are illustrated well in this dialogue, because I think that the dialogue ends with Socrates making the mistake, not Euthyphro. All right, so I have another slide I'm going to go to called Morals of the Story, and that's the last slide. So I'll finish that and I'll say a couple of more things about this. Morals of the Story. Genuine philosophical inquiry is inconclusive. Well, yeah, it often is, but I don't think it is in the way that I just said, like that there are never final answers. I think that much philosophical inquiry is inconclusive, but we can conclude that we know that certain things are what they are, and we could know what they're not. I mean, and often we can at least invalidate claims. We could say that claim is not valid or it's not true, right? Even if we don't know what alternative claim on that subject is true, right? But I do agree that almost all of our knowledge is fraught with some kind of deep conceptual confusion, and that philosophical analysis can at least uncover it and clarify things, right? But I think it is true that the more we learn about something, it's more like scratching the surface, right? The more we learn about something, the more we realize how little we know about it, right? The island of knowledge keeps expanding, but the bigger that it gets, the smaller that we realize that it is relative to everything that we don't know. There's a saying about college students. I think it was one of my colleagues who said this to me, I'm not sure, that students enter college thinking that they know everything, but they know very little. And if we do our jobs correctly, when they graduate, they know a lot more than they knew when they got in, but they think that they know less, right? So that's that thing about the island of knowledge. The bigger that it gets, the smaller that you realize that it is relative to all that can be known. All right, this is a kind of philosophical Socratic conclusion, okay? And so for that reason, we want to expand our knowledge, even though the more we learn, the more limited we realize our knowledge is. And that's why Voltaire's Brahmin, by the way, I don't believe I assigned that, but it's in the Dropbox if you want to take a look at it. It's only a paragraph, it's like a page long story by Voltaire about a Brahmin, a knowledgeable high priest in the Indian Hindu religion, who has everything. He's wealthy, he's got all this knowledge and everything, but he's like Indian philosophy is so philosophically rich that a thinking person who's a Brahmin will have this kind of Socratic realization. And this poor fellow, he has to officiate at weddings and funerals and all that and give people moral advice, but he admits that privately he knows so much that he realizes that he hardly believes any of it, and he's not really happy, but he wouldn't trade his happiness for ignorance. This is an ignorant peasant who lives across the street from him, who washes her clothes in the Ganges, chanting to Krishna, let's just say, and she's happy and blissfully ignorant, right? And Voltaire asks him, Brahmin, why wouldn't you prefer to be happy? Isn't the goal of life happiness? And it's like, yes, it is, but I would rather have my knowledge and my unhappiness than to be ignorantly blissful. You know the saying, ignorance is bliss. All right, so that's a little bit of preaching about Socratic conclusions. We should examine everything. If you're a philosopher, then you favor moving in the direction of Voltaire's unhappy or dissatisfied Socrates, Voltaire's unhappy Brahmin, or you should prefer, as John Stuart Mill said, I'd rather be an unsatisfied Socrates than a happy pig rolling around in mud like a blissfully ignorant human being. All right, so we should engage in the method of elenchus, Elenchus, the method of cross-examination. We should scratch the surface of all of our ideas, because most human ignorance, I would say many, if not most, human suffering is related to our ignorance and to our inattention, right? Our mindlessness. So we should be mindful of everything. And part of being mindful is to be analytically, critically examining all of our concepts and categories about everything. Okay, so recap quickly about Socratic method. You ask a question, or somebody makes a proposal, you ask a question, you get an answer, which is a proposal, typically an authority figure, but it doesn't have to be. Then you engage in critical analysis of the proposal, and you make a decision. It's either acceptable or not. If you accept it, then you've got some knowledge, and it might be just that the statement is false, right? Or we haven't established it as true. That's some kind of knowledge. Or if it's not accepted, it needs to be either revised or rejected. If you think that it's salvageable because of the midwife of ideas kind of approach and the principle of charitable interpretation, then you try to revise it and even help the person revise it. You try to give it a steel man as opposed to a straw man, remember? The principle of charitable interpretation, right? But then my critique at the very end, my last bullet on this slide is don't get so hooked on elenchus, the method of Socratic cross-examination, that you overlook your own error. I think I'm the only philosopher that I know who accuses Socrates of making this misstep. To accuse Socrates of making a misstep is like accusing Jesus of committing a sin or something like that for Christians, right? When it comes to philosophers, Socrates is like the father of Western philosophy. But I think that my objection is valid. So I said I would say a few more things at the end. That's the end of the slides. So I think that idea, like I said, restricted to things that are in the morally neutral category, things like working at a certain time, the Sabbath rule, right? How human beings interact with God or gods. Divine command theory of religious ethics restricted to man's relationship to divinity, that makes sense. When it comes to things in the morally bad category or the morally good category, I don't think it makes sense. That's man-to-man justice relationships. Those things are good or bad because they have the characteristics that they have, which either promote needless suffering and unjust torture of the innocent and stuff like that, or because they bring about well-being and happiness and that sort of thing, right? So the problem is when this narrow interpretation of piety as, human beings being observant of the rules of their religion, insofar as the rules of the religion relate only to God. When the rules of the religion, right, like I said earlier, like God sometimes reminds us that murder is bad and that honoring our parents is good, right? Those things are human to human rules, and God can inform us of them and try to encourage us, and he might even punish us for disobeying those things if he exists, right? But those things don't become bad or good because God likes or dislikes them or punishes or rewards us for them. They're good or bad on their own terms, right? And so when people take the attitude about piety rules, like the Sabbath, and extend that to the other things, right? Then they come up with this faulty interpretation that breaking these kinds of rules or obeying them because my religion said so gives a kind of divine justification for imposing my religious beliefs and enacting them on people who are not members of my religion. And that's problematic, right? See, I think you understand that that's a big problem. Saying, well, my God told me to do this. Like the goddess Kali said to her followers, who are called thuggees, Thugees, which is where the word thug originally comes from. This is a Hindu goddess who's dripping blood, long tongue hanging out of her mouth like a Rolling Stone poster. She's got a garland of skulls around her neck. She's standing on a dead body and got sword in one hand and another kind of weapon in the other. Right? This is the goddess Kali. Her followers would perform human sacrifices to her. Right? So this is like what God asked Abraham to do. So that's this side of it. Killing an innocent person to appease a powerful being is immoral, no matter who that being is. Right? I disagree with Abraham and the followers of the goddess Kali. Right? Whereas if she said, offer me some oranges or light some incense, or circle around my statue 3 times and chant Om, Kali Om, or whatever it is, right? Those things are okay. But things over here, you can't take a good thing and make it bad, or take a bad thing and make it good just because you're a god and you said so. Because those things are good or bad independently of whether or not gods exist. That's my theory on it anyway. All right, so something had come to me when I was going over it just now for the first time that I want to try to revisit and capture, and if I can remember it, it'll be part of this video. If not, we'll end inconclusively. And there's that sense of it, because there's always like more learning that you could do, no matter how clear you are on a subject, right? That's part of the Socratic attitude. We could always be wrong, and that's part of the scientific enterprise also. This is the best to our knowledge so far. Further data, further evidence, and further analysis of it, we could come up with better ideas, which always improve upon and don't reject the previous ideas, right? So there's that. That's a better way of looking at it, rather than saying, oh, well, science just keeps disproving itself, so it's no good. No, it just keeps getting better and better and better. And the method for its doing so is built into it. So when I said Socrates could have gone on and asked Euthyphro, well, why would, Ripetti be happy that his son gave him that deck of playing cards? I thought that we might be able to go further with that, right? And let's see, God or the gods would like us to grow, so they would be happy seeing us grow. Why would they be happy seeing us grow? Because they care about us. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of got a thought when I was lecturing on that there might be a possible way to make it further problematic. But I'll have to rewatch the video myself and see if that moment triggers it in me, because I can't remember it right now. But I did remember something else that I wanted to say before we end. And that just slipped my mind. All right, so just give me a moment here. Euthyphro was wrong. Now I'm trying to retrace my steps here. Euthyphro was right and Socrates was wrong. Oh well. If it comes to me, I'll post it somewhere on as a comment to this video, or on our Blackboard course management system, or on Facebook or something. But it's just not coming to me. It's a kind of embarrassing way to end a lecture, but this head scratching of like, I know that there's something else that's problematic about my account, but I can't think of it. There was 2 different things that I wanted to say, and I can't think of either one, but that's okay. All right, folks, that's the end of this lecture. Sorry I dragged it out another couple of minutes unnecessarily.